Today, we're tackling something, well, pretty controversial. We're unpacking an argument that asks a really fundamental question. Is the United Nations not just failing, but completely obsolete? The source we're digging into today says yes, and it argues we should just get rid of it entirely. So yeah, let's get right into it. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the original promise versus what the source calls today's reality. Then we'll get into its biggest job, keeping the peace. After that, we'll see why the source thinks it's broken by design, then the practical inefficiencies, and we'll wrap up with the wild idea, what would a world without the UN actually look like?
All right, first up, we got to go back to the beginning. The whole argument kicks off by drawing this really sharp line between the big, hopeful ideals of 1945 and what our source calls the ugly reality of today. And boom, here's the core of it. The argument is that the UN isn't a serious player anymore. It's just going through the motions, a relic. And that phrase, it really tells you everything you need to know about the perspective we're about to unpack.
I mean, look at this contrast. On one hand, you have the promise from 1945. Never again. This idea of everyone working together to prevent another world war. And on the other hand, the source's take on today, a toothless circus. It's saying the UN just pretends there's order, while the real world is on fire and the UN has basically no say in it. Okay, so that brings us to the second point. And honestly, this is the big one. The source argues the UN has failed at its one single most important job, keeping the peace. Now, to really get this critique, you have to know how they're measuring success. They're not looking at aid work or cultural stuff. Nope. It all boils down to one simple question. Can the UN stop the big guys from fighting? And according to this source, the answer is a hard no, a total failure. And they use a specific case study to make their point. Operation Roaring Lion. The argument is, look, when things get serious, the major powers just ignore the UN. They didn't even ask for a UN mandate. It's like the UN isn't even part of the equation for the people who actually have the firepower. So, the source says this isn't just happening by chance. It's a deliberate choice. Countries are actively avoiding the UN because they see it as a trap, something that causes strategic paralysis. I mean, in a world moving at the speed of light with all kinds of new threats, who has time to wait for UN committee? The real work, the source says, is happening elsewhere, in direct alliances, sharing intel. All right, so this leads right into the UN's own rulebook. The argument here is that the problem isn't just what the UN does, but what it is, that it's basically designed to fail, to be stuck in a permanent gridlock. Just take a look at the vetoes in the Security Council. The source presents this data to say, see, the veto isn't a safety valve, it's a weapon. Russia, the US, they use it constantly to shut things down and protect their own interests. The result? The council can't do anything meaningful when a big power is involved. And this quote just nails their perspective. It's not a Security Council, it's a theater for superpower obstruction. It's basically saying it's just a show, a place where big countries go to say no to each other, so nothing ever really changes. The problem is baked right into the system. But it's not just the Security Council. Oh no. The critique then moves over to the General Assembly, and the language gets even tougher. The source calls it a propaganda fire hose. And here's the data they use to back that up. Look at how these big voting blocs, like the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the G77, vote together almost all the time. The argument is that this isn't a real debate. It's just blocs voting along predetermined lines, passing resolutions that sound important but don't actually do anything. So, we've talked high-level politics. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty, the day-to-day operations. Because the argument here is that the UN isn't just broken at the top, its basic machinery is slow, outdated, and maybe even corrupt. And this next point is really interesting. Think about one of the UN's old jobs, being the neutral eyes on the ground, the fact-finders. Well, the source argues technology has made that role obsolete. Back in the day, you needed UN observers. Now, some analyst with a laptop and access to satellite images can often find out what's happening faster and more accurately. Take the Minib school strike, for example. The open source intel community online was all over it, verifying, analyzing, days before the UN even put out a statement. So the UN goes from being the source of truth to just being a bottleneck. It's just too slow. Okay, but what about humanitarian aid? That's the one thing everyone says the UN does well, right? Well, the source doesn't hold back here either. It points to scandals at agencies like UNWRA as proof of deep problems. The argument is that smaller, faster groups, or even just countries helping other countries directly, are way more effective. They get the job done without all the UN bureaucracy and politics. So, if the UN is as broken as this source claims, then what? What's the alternative? Well, this last section is all about that. It's about a vision for a world after the UN, a world that the source says is already starting to happen. They even have a name for it, Millibration. And the idea is pretty simple. Instead of one giant global organization for everyone, you have smaller, more focused alliances. Groups of countries that team up because they share the same interests or values. Pacts that are built to, actually do stuff. And here are the prime examples. You've got NATO, AUKUS, the Quad, the Abraham Accords. The source holds these up as proof that this model works. They're functional, they're focused on results, and they're the complete opposite of what they describe as the UN's gridlock. And this logic extends even to things like international law. The source is incredibly blunt here, calling documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights worthless paper. The reasoning? Because these documents do absolutely nothing to stop atrocities in places like North Korea or China. It's an illusion of justice, not the real thing. Then there's the money argument. You look at this chart and it's pretty clear. A handful of Western nations pay for most of the UN. And yet, the source says, they're the ones who get criticized the most in places like the General Assembly. It's a weird system, right? You're basically paying people to condemn you. And that brings us to the grand finale, the final conclusion of the argument. Getting rid of the UN, they say, wouldn't lead to chaos. Just the opposite. It would get rid of all the hypocrisy and let countries get back to real, honest diplomacy, where everyone knows where they stand and nations deal with each other directly. So we're left with this really sharp question from the source. They call the UN a 1945 talking shop, an old idea for an old world. After everything we've just gone over, is it time to just move on? That's the big, challenging idea this source wants us to think about. Thanks for joining me.